In the spring of 1886, Elias Caldwell was a man standing on the very edge of ruin. He lived in the Nebraska sandhills, a landscape of rolling, grass-covered dunes that stretched out like a frozen beige ocean. The sandhills did not forgive weakness, and lately, Elias had been nothing but weak. 2 years of drought had decimated his meager crops. The bank in Omaha held the paper on his land, and the crushing weight of his debts kept him awake, staring at the ceiling of his sod house until the pale morning light broke over the prairie. Elias was 44 years old. He looked 54. Sun had tanned his skin into something resembling old saddle leather, and the relentless, howling wind of the plains had carved deep, permanent lines into his face. He lived in a house made of literal dirt, blocks of prairie turf cut from the earth and stacked to form walls. When it rained, the roof leaked mud. When it was dry, dirt sifted down into his coffee. He was profoundly, agonizingly alone. He needed help. He needed a partner to share the backbreaking labor. But he knew, with mathematical certainty, that no sane woman would travel 1,000 miles to live in a mud cave with a middle-aged man drowning in debt. So he lied. He opened a copy of the Heart and Hand Matrimonial catalog and drafted a letter. He did not describe the sod house. Instead, he wrote of a sprawling, thriving cattle ranch. He described a grand 2-story timber home, with a wraparound porch painted white, looking out over thousands of acres of prime grazing land. He described himself as a successful, gentlemanly rancher in his early 30s, looking for a refined companion to share in his frontier empire. To complete the illusion, he included a tintype photograph. It was a picture of himself, yes, but it had been taken 15 years earlier, in a borrowed suit, before the prairie had taken its toll on his eyes and his posture. He sealed the envelope, sent it east, and waited. 1,000 miles away, in the deafening, suffocating belly of a Chicago textile mill, Josephine Miller read his advertisement. Josephine's reality was a nightmare of industrial progress. She worked 14 hours a day, 6 days a week, standing before a massive mechanical loom that roared so loudly she had permanently lost some of the hearing in her left ear. The air in the factory was thick with white cotton dust, a particulate fog that settled in her lungs and gave her a chronic, hacking cough. She lived in a cramped, freezing boarding house with 6 other women, terrified of the day she would become too sick or too old to work, at which point the city would simply discard her onto the street. Josephine was 35. In the harsh economics of the late 19th century working class, she was already considered an old maid. Her hands were scarred and calloused from the machinery, and her posture was permanently bent from leaning over the looms. She was desperate for a way out. She was desperate for air. She read Elias's letter. She read about the sprawling estate, the wealth, the white timber house. She knew that a successful, wealthy rancher in his 30s did not want a 35-year-old factory worker with a bad cough. So she lied. She wrote back in a flowing practice script. She described herself as a robust, fresh-faced 22-year-old country girl. She claimed she had been raised on a thriving dairy farm in upstate New York. She wrote beautifully about her deep knowledge of agriculture, her ability to cook vast meals for ranch hands, her skill at churning butter, and her eager willingness to bear strong, healthy children for a successful man. To complete her illusion, she went to a cheap photography studio in Chicago. She did not send a picture of herself. She paid a pretty, young, 20-year-old seamstress from her boarding house to sit for the portrait. She sealed the envelope, sent it west, and prepared to run. Neither of them felt guilt. In a world that offers you no quarter, deception is not a moral failing. It is a survival strategy. 3 months later, the Union Pacific train hissed and shrieked to a halt at the dusty, windswept station in North Platte, Nebraska. This was the moment of collision. Josephine stepped off the train. She was wearing a practical, heavy wool dress she had sewn herself. She clutched a single, battered leather valise containing everything she owned in the world. She stood on the wooden platform, looking through the crowd of transient laborers and cattlemen, searching for the dashing, wealthy young gentleman from the photograph. Elias was standing by the water tower. He was wearing faded, dust-caked overalls and a frayed canvas coat. He held a crumpled tintype photograph of a beautiful 20-year-old girl. He scanned the faces of the women disembarking, looking for his youthful dairymaid. They were the last 2 people on the platform. Elias looked at the photograph in his hand. Then he looked at the tired, 35-year-old woman standing 10 feet away, gripping her valise with white knuckles. Josephine looked at the photograph in her hand. Then she looked at the weathered, 44-year-old dirt farmer staring back at her. The realization hit them both at the exact same second. Silence. It wasn't a dramatic explosion of anger. It wasn't a screaming match. It was the crushing, suffocating silence of two cornered animals realizing the trap had closed. Elias slowly walked toward her. He didn't introduce himself. He simply held up the picture of the young girl. "You are not 22, he said. His voice was flat, hollowed out by the sheer magnitude of the disaster. Josephine looked at his frayed overalls, the dirt under his fingernails, and the deep, exhausted lines around his eyes. She held up the picture of the young man in the suit. "And you," she replied, her voice trembling but hard, "do not own a white timber house. Checkmate." They stood there in the Nebraska wind, entirely exposed. The avatars had evaporated. The raw truth was standing in the dirt. Under normal circumstances, this is where the story ends. The woman gets back on the train. The man walks back to his farm. But poverty is a lock with no key. Josephine had spent every penny she had saved for 5 years to buy the one-way ticket to North Platte. She had exactly 42 cents left in her purse. She could not go back to Chicago. Elias had borrowed against his next, non-existent harvest just to buy the wagon team to come pick her up. He had no money to buy her a return ticket. He couldn't even afford a hotel room for the night. They were trapped. Not by romance and not by law. They were trapped by mutual, absolute destitution. Elias picked up her valise. He didn't look at her. "The wagon is this way." The ride to the homestead took 2 days. It was a journey into the death of an illusion. Every mile they traveled further from the railroad tracks. The landscape grew more desolate, more alien, and more terrifying. There were no trees. There were no grand estates. There was only the endless rolling sea of beige grass. In 1888, a pioneer woman named Miriam Davis Colt wrote a journal entry about her own arrival in the West that perfectly mirrors Josephine's experience. She wrote, "I looked around the endless horizon for the grand home promised and saw only a dark, cheerless hole in the earth. The reality of this life strips you of every pretense. You cannot lie to the prairie. It will find you out and it will break you unless you are made of something harder than pride." When they finally arrived at Elias's claim, Josephine stepped down from the wagon and stared at the sod house. It literally looked like a grave that had been dug into the side of a small hill. The door was made of rough-hewn planks. The window was covered with oiled paper, not glass. "This is the grand estate," she said, her voice entirely devoid of emotion. "It is," Elias replied, tying off the horses. "And the thousands of cattle? I have one milk cow, and she is currently dry." They walked inside. The smell of damp earth and burning dried buffalo dung, the only fuel available on the treeless plains, was overwhelming. The first month was a masterclass in friction and failure. The fake identities they had constructed in their letters were not just lies, they were actively dangerous. Elias expected Josephine to know how to manage a frontier kitchen. She did not. On her 3rd day, trying to cook over an open hearth for the first time in her life, she severely burned her hand and ruined a week's worth of precious flour by using salt instead of lye to try and leaven the bread. She didn't know how to slaughter a chicken. She was terrified of the vast open sky, suffering from a crippling agoraphobia after spending her entire life inside a walled city and a dark factory. Josephine expected Elias to be a gentleman who could provide. He could not. The creditors rode out to the farm twice in the first month, threatening to seize the dry cow and the plow. Elias was irritable, deeply ashamed of his poverty, and entirely incapable of comforting the woman he had dragged into his nightmare. They slept on opposite sides of the small sod room. They barely spoke. The hostility was thick enough to cut with an axe. They resented each other profoundly, but more than that, they resented themselves. Every time Elias looked at Josephine, he saw his own failure as a man. Every time Josephine looked at Elias, she saw the pathetic, desperate gullibility that had led her to trust a piece of paper. They were playing house in a graveyard. The breaking point arrived in late November. It began as a deceptively warm afternoon. The sky was an eerie, pale blue. But by 3 p.m., a low, dark gray wall appeared on the northern horizon. It didn't roll in, it slammed into the prairie. The temperature dropped 40 degrees in less than 20 minutes. The wind began to scream, a high-pitched, demonic howl, carrying a blinding wall of razor-sharp ice crystals. It was a Great Plains blizzard. Inside the sod house, the temperature plummeted. The small iron stove, fueled only by twisted clumps of prairie grass and buffalo chips, could not keep up with the freezing cold radiating from the earthen walls. Elias was frantic. He had a dozen newly purchased sheep, bought on credit in a desperate gamble, penned in a flimsy wooden corral about 200 yards from the house. If they froze, he was entirely permanently ruined. He put on his frayed canvas coat, tied a rope around his waist, tied the other end to the door handle, and walked out into the whiteout. He was gone for 3 hours. Josephine sat in the dark, freezing sod house. The wind shook the heavy wooden door so violently she thought it would splinter. The cold was beginning to numb her fingers and toes. A deep, primal terror set in. She was a city woman. She knew about factory fires and street crime. She knew nothing about freezing to death in a mud hut. When Elias finally stumbled back through the door, he fell onto the dirt floor. He was covered in a thick shell of ice. He had managed to drag the sheep into a small dugout shelter, but it had cost him. His coat was frozen solid. His hands were blue. He was shivering so violently, his teeth were chipping against each other. Hypothermia was setting in. Josephine dragged him toward the stove. She tried to pull his coat off, but the fabric was torn, frozen, and completely useless. She realized with absolute clarity that if he died, she died. There was no one coming to save them. No agency, no catalog, no avatar. The fake country girl had to disappear. The real Josephine Miller had to step forward. She wasn't a dairy maid. She didn't know how to churn butter, but she had spent 20 years in a Chicago textile mill. She understood fabric. She understood insulation. She understood how to construct something out of nothing. She opened her battered leather valise. She pulled out her heavy wool skirts, the only valuable things she owned. She took her sewing shears, and without a second thought, she began to rip the expensive wool apart. She pulled heavy canvas sacks from the corner of the room. She found Elias's ruined summer blankets. Working with a speed and precision that could only be forged in a sweatshop, she began to sew. Her hands flew, the needle piercing thick canvas and heavy wool. She constructed a massive, heavily insulated sleeping bag, layering the canvas to block the wind and the wool to trap the heat. She stripped the frozen, useless clothes off Elias's shivering body. She forced him into the makeshift wool cocoon. She dragged him practically on top of the small stove, and then, having no other source of heat in the freezing cabin, she crawled into the heavy wool layers with him, pressing her own body heat against his freezing skin. They lay there in the dark, the storm screaming outside, shaking the earth itself. For 2 days, the blizzard raged. For 2 days, they did not move from the floor by the stove. In that forced, terrifying intimacy, the walls finally broke. "I'm 35, she whispered into the dark, her voice hoarse. "I coughed blood last winter. I was terrified I would die in that factory." Elias was silent for a long time. The shivering had stopped. "I'm 44, he replied quietly. "I owe the bank $300. I have never owned a white timber house. I wanted to know what it felt like to write the words down." They didn't argue. They didn't yell. The exhaustion had burned away the pride. "You sew fast," he noted, feeling the thick, impenetrable seams of the wool cocoon that was keeping them alive. "I can sew 100 stitches a minute," she said. "I am useless with a plow, but I can make a coat that will withstand anything this prairie throws at us." "I am useless at being a gentleman," Elias admitted into the dark, "but I didn't lose a single sheep today. I can keep us alive." When the storm finally broke on the third morning, they emerged from the wool cocoon. They looked at each other in the pale, freezing light filtering through the oiled paper window. The glamorous young rancher was gone. The fresh-faced dairy maid was dead. What remained was a scarred, aging factory worker with incredible mechanical skill and a weathered, indebted dirt farmer with an unbreakable will to survive. They had lied to find a fantasy, but the fantasy would have died in that blizzard. It was the harsh, ugly, incredibly capable reality of their true selves that had survived the night. Elias looked at the intricate, heavy stitching on the wool. He looked at Josephine's calloused, scarred hands. He didn't see an old maid. He saw a warrior. "We need a better door," he said quietly. "If you can sew canvas to line the frame, I will cut the timber to build it." Josephine looked at him. She didn't see a fraud. She saw a partner. "Cut the timber," she said. That was the actual beginning of their marriage. They never built the white timber house. But over the next 20 years, Elias and Josephine Caldwell built a thriving, unshakable homestead. Josephine started a side business, sewing heavy, wind-proof winter gear for other homesteaders using her factory skills, bringing in hard currency that paid off Elias's debts. Elias managed the land with a brutal, relentless efficiency, slowly expanding their herd. They became one of the most respected couples in the Sandhills. not because they were wealthy, and not because they were beautiful, but because they were indestructible. We spend so much of our lives terrified of the raw truth. We build facades, we write resumes, we curate profiles, all designed to hide the parts of ourselves we believe are unlovable, incapable, or broken. We believe that if someone saw the real us, the debt, the scars, the fear, the age, they would walk away. But Josephine and Elias discovered the ultimate paradox of human connection. The lie might get them to the train station, but true intimacy, true safety, and true respect can only begin the exact moment the lie collapses. You cannot build a life with an avatar. You can only build a life with a human being. The people who truly love you will not love you for the grand estate you pretend to own. They will love you for the way you hold the line when the blizzard hits. Because the raw truth is always better than a beautiful lie. If this story made you stop and think about the masks we wear, I have a question for you. Think deeply about it before you answer. Have you ever had a moment in your life where you were forced to drop a facade with someone? What happened when the raw truth came out? Did it break the relationship, or did it finally make it real? Leave a comment below. I want to read your experiences. Let's talk about it.